believe that people are at the heart of successful organizations. And so we're a mastermind of reward professionals dedicated to creating workplaces where people thrive, employers reward, and customers love. So this show discusses leadership strategies for top executives and senior professionals to make a meaningful evolution in their rewards environment at their organization. So first, I would love to share my screen here, and I'm going to be showing you our hosts and so forth. Just give me 1 second here. All right. So first of all, we're going to be talking about how to understand and stay ahead of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And so with that effort, I'm going to introduce to you our host, which we have Howard Nisewitz, Jackson Brockway, and myself. We're going to take you through this journey today. But we have a guest with us. Today's discussion zeroes in on that topic of pay transparency. And so we brought in an expert guide on this journey. And this is Timothy London, a partner of and chief sales expert at Sysarb, whose relentless determination and disciplined approach have propelled fast-growing technology for organizations across the globe overall. So many companies we're going to be talking about. So with this profound belief in the power of pay transparency to foster modern, high-performing organizations, Timmy has dedicated himself to navigating the complexities of pay equity, which can be quite daunting on a global basis. So his track record is impressive, from scaling at Sysarb to leading a position in pay transparency sphere. So he advises in making sure that companies stay ahead of the game on this overall. So let's get ready to dive into this discussion, how your organization can not only comply with the EU Pay Transparency Directive, but also think about how pay transparency is spreading across the globe overall. So we want to make sure that we are ready for all of you multinationals out there that are getting ready for this initiative. So Timmy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. What a nice introduction.
So first of all, let's talk a little bit about your background. I mean, what gave you a passion to really get into pay transparency and help companies with this initiative?
Right. So I joined the company 5 years ago, Sysarb, and we are a Swedish-based tech company in this space. So we've been operating within supporting clients with the pay equity practices and supporting them with basically answer the question, do we pay people fairly? We've done that for almost 2 decades. So next year we're celebrating 20 years. And I mean, the truthful story is that I know the CTO since quite some time. So he recruited me. He said, Timmy, we need some help with sales. And so I joined 5 years ago. And it's been very exciting because the last 2 years, the trend and the scope and the complexity has tenfold in this space. You know, with the Pay Transparency Directive coming, but everything's going on in Australia, also like South Africa, Brazil, USA. It's a complex space. So it's a very exciting times and it's a fun space to be within. Yeah,
no kidding. I mean, I think that the pay transparency has evolved and pay fairness, frankly, has evolved quite amount over the past, I don't know what so almost 50 years, I guess we started talking about pay fairness more and more. And it's taken us a long time to get to where we are today, where we're starting to think about this more on a global basis. And so from your perspective, Timmy, I mean, what are what types of companies should be thinking about pay fairness and transparency, right?
I mean, I would say everybody, even if you're a small firm, because and the challenges are probably a bit different. So from a compliance perspective, the threshold in Europe is 100 employees and above. So of course you want to be compliant to the law. So if you're 100 employees, of course you are involved. But I would say if you're taking Europe as a focus to start with, so the directive is for 100 employees. But I would say a lot of companies with maybe 50, 60, 70 employees, they also want to be, you know, proactive in this space from like an employee branding perspective, making sure we're paying people fairly so we can lower retention, you know, stuff like that. So yeah, go ahead.
But to be clear, I mean, so it's like like all companies should really be doing pay transparency or pay fairness,
Sure,
but specifically in the EU and several different parts of the globe, there's different thresholds for requiring regular reporting and also certain actions that companies need to take. And so when you're saying in Europe, the threshold is what again for that?
100 employees.
Okay. And then what are they required to do differently?
So since it's a podcast, I can do first a short answer and I can do more in detail. So for those of you who are listening, the main thing is 4 aspects, I would say, to make it summarize as easy as possible. The first one is pay transparency for job seekers. So you have to have, you know, the pay range in your ads, and you will not be allowed to ask for pay history. So if I'm a recruiting manager, I can answer the candidate the previous pay, for example. So influence the recruitment process. And then you also have right to information for employees. So if I'm working for a company with 100 employees or above, or actually there's no threshold for this aspect, I will be able to get access to data from the aspect, okay, do my company pay people fairly from a gender perspective? What's the average pay between men and women? And broken down into my position. So if I'm a sales rep, for example, I will be able to see what is the average earnings for the female reps and the male. And that would be quite complex for most organizations to provide. Then you have the third aspect, which is transparency for when it comes to career paths for the employees. So if I'm working for an employer, I need to know, I will be able to know what is my next step, what is required for me, and what is the pay for that position. So all of those things like this is good things, right? But it's quite administrative in the beginning to get those things in place.
So Timmy, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The last part is reporting. So if your pay gap is higher than 5%, then you're supposed to create a gender pay gap report and publish it on your website and to your employees and everybody. So it's a quite administrative driven directive, and it basically requires software, I would say. It will be difficult to do this manually in like Excel and similar. Right.
And so if there's what about multinational companies that have presence in Europe? Does this apply to them?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think, okay, so if you're a big enterprise, imagine like Volkswagen or like a big one, but even like imagine a company with a couple of thousand employees. In Europe, there are 31 countries, or actually it's 27 in the European Union, but UK, Iceland, Switzerland, and Norway will most likely follow the rest. So it's 31 countries. And there's 25 different languages spoken. So that means if you're a big multinational and you have a representation in quite a lot of European countries, you'll have to do different processes for each country in different local languages. So if your headquarters is based in New York or London or wherever, do they speak 10 different languages at your headquarters in your team, in the HR team? Most likely not. So that brings a lot of complexity from the reporting perspective. Yes.
I have a question. You mentioned about the reporting with the pay gap is 5% or more. Is there a period of time in which they need to remediate that to fix it?
So the directive is like a big frame. So the Commission and the Parliament in Europe decide, okay, this is the frame. Now all the countries in Europe, the 27 member states, they can take that frame and implement in local law. So okay. a lot of the details, like your question, is a bit unclear, and that's a challenge because the timeline, to have that in mind as well, is 3 years. The directive was voted through last year. All the paperwork was done in June last year, which means about 3 years. 1 year has passed almost. It's 2 years left, and still nobody knows exactly how will Germany, France, Italy do. Which means so quite few companies have started. So there's going to be quite intensive 2 years ahead, I would say. So long answer to your question, but it's a good question because maybe there is somebody who can answer this from like a lawyer or something, but from my understanding, those details are not in place yet.
But it's made public, you said?
Yes.
So really it's in the company's best interest to get it fixed as soon as possible. regardless of whether it's legislated or not.
Totally. And if you imagine if you have a 10% pay gap this year, if you put your report, everybody going to follow next year. What's the progression? Because if you're looking at UK that has the reporting requirement since 2017, now the reports for this year is that the pay gaps for all the biggest enterprises are increasing. And Ireland got a gender pay gap reporting requirement 2 years ago. So there's a big debate in Ireland saying, okay, UK had this for now. This is 7th year or 8th year they're supposed to do the report. And it's getting worse. So it's quite fascinating that we're moving actually in the wrong way in a lot of countries.
So that's interesting. So Timmy, you're saying that the since they implemented this in Ireland, they've actually found that some statistics are going in the other direction that they intended.
Yeah, in the United Kingdom, in UK, they've seen those data, and that's for the biggest companies. I think it was like the 100 largest employers.
And in your experience, what's been driving that strange trend?
I would say it's quite a lot of different things for different industries, but one thing that was quite, I mean, COVID was quite negative. I don't have the latest data, but this is my understanding. So it might be different. But my understanding is, at least last time I read about it, when they did research on the COVID, industries that were mostly hit from COVID, like travel industry or like a lot of different industries, most of them were female dominated. And most, in Europe at least, a lot of women took a big hit of being home with kids and stuff like that. So like a year after COVID or like shortly after COVID, they said we lost I think it was like 40 years of progression in the equal or like pay equity aspect. So say some of the driving factors could be COVID, for example, and not like a recession, stuff like that. Yeah, so
that's very interesting. I've read similar studies relating to that as well. You know, that COVID has caused some of the traditional gender roles to come out again that we worked so hard to alleviate over the number of years, and then now there's further concern with the coming back to work initiative. A lot of organizations are requiring people to come back to work, and it's causing a bit of a fear in the workforce because there are a lot of people that have realized how hard it was to find childcare, how hard it was to have some of their basic needs met. If they once again rely on a traditional work environment, in something like a pandemic happens again, that they will be at a disadvantage once more. So I think that's interesting that there's actual numbers around that. Now the one thing is the Europe and the UK are ahead of tracking these numbers compared to the United States. And so we see a lot of these statistics starting to come in now, but the people have only been thinking about pay fairness in a regulatory capacity for a much lesser time. So I think that we'll start to see these numbers come forward soon.
Yeah, I think the directive in Europe will be a big paradigm shift. Because one of the big things with the directive is that, what's the English word? You will have fines if you don't comply. So if you're looking, I'm based in Sweden on the West Coast. So Sweden has those kind of laws for, decades, reporting, doing pay analysis, stuff like that. And Sweden has one of the lowest pay gaps in Europe. I think we ranked the #1 most equal country in Europe. But in Sweden, there are no fines, if you exaggerate a bit, but it's like very few companies that don't comply with the law do get a fine. But now, for example, there's a big case in UK, in the United Kingdom, with Tesco, which is one of the, if not the biggest retail store. They are being sued. I think the last number I saw was 5 billion euros. But I mean, they have like hundreds of thousands of employees. So I think it's like 15,000 female workers went together in a lawsuit. But that would be a big case. And if Tesco loses that one, you have hundreds of similar retail stores that has a similar compensation structures as Tesco do have, where the loss. So I think once we see the first big losses in Europe, and we'll most likely see those after directives like 2028 or forward, or 2027 and forward, that will bring money to the table. That will also lower the pay gaps, because now there's like few fines and not really a heat to the laws and compliance in Europe. So
Yeah, the
yeah.
precedent set by that would be game changing if that did go through. You know,
Yeah.
one thing that I had a question about, you know, hearing about these policies in the EU, I'd say they're really comprehensive. I mean, you have it from a reporting standpoint, you know, progression as well as transparency. You know, coming from my experience in the US, you know, we have a variety of states that require ranges to be put on postings, which is pretty simple compared to what you're dealing with. One thing that stood out to me is, you know, for developing organizations, the challenge that could be around setting that next step, you know, being able to detail the progression of jobs. Have you experienced some, I'd say, fear around that in terms of putting steps in place to ensure that they are able to, you know, really clearly state that for their employees?
So among our clients, the biggest ones are like tens of thousands of employees, and the smallest ones among our clients is maybe 100. This is quite range. I would say the biggest challenge in that aspect is for the smaller sector, like the smaller
Yeah.
clients with maybe up to 1,000 employees, where you don't have those infrastructure in place, and especially if you're a company that grown quite fast. So, for example, the tech scene in Europe,
Yeah.
brought quite a lot of money the last couple of years. You have a lot of companies growing very fast. That's going to be a big challenge for them because they don't have those structures in place. And in general terms, so I would say the clients with maybe less than 1,000 employees, they lack job architecture, the grading structures. I think those will be the ones that will have quite a lot of challenge in that aspect.
Yeah, it's asking a lot from them. You know, not in a negative way, but just to set those frameworks in place so they're able to provide that to their employees.
We have,
And as you,
I have another example. We're working with one big company now that is acquiring quite a lot of companies, and that is also quite. Maybe I changed the topic now, but I think this is also interesting space. So if you're a business that acquiring quite a lot of companies, with the new directive coming in Europe, that will affect your acquisition strategy quite a lot. Because if you have 5 companies and then you're acquiring like once every year or like month or quarter, whatever, that new company will have a different compensation structure. And then you have to harmonize it because you have to have the same like title structure, career paths, you know, transparency, everything, all of that. So I'm just guessing, but I think we will see less acquisitions in Europe because it's going to be quite a lot of extra work.
yeah, not to mention you're now encompassing any potential gender pay gaps they have, or you know, pay fairness, that's now part of your reporting, and that affects your company from a overall perspective. So very interesting.
And there's another very interesting aspect in that space. If you're looking at the municipalities in Sweden, so we're working with like half of them. So there's almost 300 of them, so 150 of them as clients. Those are the ones, at least in Sweden, that has the best data, the lowest pay gaps. But municipalities, at least in Sweden, are female-dominated organizations because you have a lot of teachers and, you know, similar roles. The new directive demands you to do one analysis per the whole company. So in Sweden at the moment, you do like company by company. So for a municipality, for example, you're looking at all the teachers. That's like one analysis. And then you do one analysis for everybody working with, you know, environmental aspects and, you know, handling water supplies, electricity, stuff like that. That's usually a male-dominated part of the business. Now, if you're supposed to, with the director looking at the whole business, or like the whole company or organization, your data will not be too good. Because if you're looking at, once again, the municipalities, the teachers, and you know that sector of the business, good data. The engineers, good data. But when you combine them, it's going to be challenging saying, why do our engineers, for example, or the male-dominated job positionings have a way higher salary profile? Stuff like that. So the directive, one big main takeaway for everybody listening is the directive will be huge, and it will affect most of Western world, or like all of the world. Most countries will look into what does Europe do, and that will come. So that's like Australia, South Africa, Canada, US.
Is the focus right now primarily gender? They're not tackling race at this point?
Yes, focused gender. Next step. So Europe has some challenge with ethnicity, right, from history, but I think that will come as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's just my guess. That's the next step, but that might be 10 years from now or something. Yeah.
So when you're looking at pay transparency, and I apologize, Sam, if you were going, but is it primarily from a job by job basis, or are you looking at it in terms of career level as well, in terms of entry level professionals developing in their reporting?
So the analysis is both. So
Okay.
you're supposed to look into individuals, but also like a grade level or like a job family or however you provide it. The reporting, however, is on findings where like the job family or like the grade or like the big structure. Yeah.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, that might be reaching the capabilities, the limits of doing Excel. So this is where the need for a system really comes into play.
Yeah, that's another. So, I mean, I represent Sysarb. We're a software company, so that's my aspect of it. But if I'm gonna not talk with emotion, but rather facts, the directive is really a software-driven directive because it's gonna be difficult to be compliant with, generate the reports manually in Word documents or similar. It's gonna take a lot of time. So you want to have that in the software so you can use automate it. So you get one report in Germany according to the German standards and one in Spain, etc. But also from transparency, Excel is great, but it will be difficult to be transparent in Excel because too much data. You want to bring out the big numbers, like where is the challenges? If like a CEO asks the HR department, tell me, what is the status? What's the challenge? What business unit drives the biggest risks? You want to click a button, then bam, bam, bam. Here you go.
Yeah, the challenges along with just the opportunity for error there. Anytime you're working through spreadsheets manually, there's a lot of risk of error.
Yeah, we had right. We had one client that came a couple of years ago. I think I can mention them. So we started working with Spotify a couple of years ago. They were working in Excel, got some challenge because they're based in 40 different countries, like 10,000 employees. These brings, when you're scaling, it's just too much Excel sheets. So they became a client, and so that's like the standard user story. Clients coming to us working with Excel, but they want to make more efficient. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that there's several companies that you've partnered closely with that you've provided case studies on and so forth, and so it's good to hear that companies like Spotify are taking a stance to showing they're moving forward on this initiative, and they're being an example, a global example on this. But it brings us back to the concept of how things are a little bit different between the United States and the rest of the world when it comes to pay fairness and transparency. One is, I think that you mentioned, is that in Europe and in different places across the globe, there's some places where there's no fines at all. I mean, it's just they're really relying on social pressure to have companies conform. And then there's other areas where they do have fines in place to try to encourage compliance. And in the U.S. is a bit of a mix. I know that there's definitely the fines and potential legal exposure that companies are under. And in the past, this is where it drove a lot of concerns. It's like, oh, if we do a study, even doing a study could be dangerous, as a legal exposure. And now, of course, a lot of the best practice in the US is to use external legal counsel that can partner with comp firms like for instance us and so forth. This is something that we help companies do. But what are you seeing as far as the major differences, and how is that helping or hurting the initiative overall?
I think you mentioned the big difference when it comes to pressure, doing it from, risk of fines and, those kind of risks. I haven't seen too much of that in Europe yet. I think that will come. Also, from my understanding is that Europe is way more focused on the individual. At least a lot of countries in Europe, they want to do the individual analysis, making sure that we're paying everybody fairly. Not only from a regression, like big math perspective, like what's the big picture, but Europe is way more detailed, I would say. I also think that Europe and the US is getting closer to each other. Is most likely the directive in Europe will have a big influence on the States, and also the States had a lot of influence on the directive when it comes to job postings, in terms of adding the salary ranges. I think once again the directive is the big frame, the big picture, and now all the countries have to implement it into local law. I hope a lot of European countries have learned from the States that we need to put some frame on the salary ranges. So you cannot say, okay, I'm recruiting for a new sales rep, the salary is very wide range, because then it doesn't add anything. So most likely, I guess in Europe there will be some frames on how big pay range you can have in your job ad. So
Yeah,
actually bring.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've witnessed in looking at pay trends across the globe, is that in the U.S. we're much more reliant on market data, and as a consequence, our market data has become very granular, especially for some of the surveys out there. You can find information on a lot of different jobs. Well, as you go to different locations around the world, market data can start getting thinner and thinner, and the jobs more general and more general overall. And so, which brings in the next piece of the equation as far as the methodology of starting to compare jobs together. In the United States, is because we have very granular market data, a lot of companies have been focusing on the classification of job evaluation using just definitions and leveling guides from survey companies and perhaps their own that they use to classify jobs and their levels. And versus Europe, since they've had the lack of market data and information, they've been more reliant on internal evaluation, driving them to methodologies such as the point factor evaluation method, which one of our partners, Gradar, and I know you're a partner of yours as well, is a master in. This is when we're looking at jobs and defining their comparable worth directly. So do you foresee the US is a classification method good enough for global use, or do you foresee there to be changes to more of a global point factor methodology in the future? What are your thoughts there?
That's a very good question. I'm actually not sure. Okay, so my thoughts, if I'm speaking as freely, it's I think the big question, or the big thing, is to have one harmonized job architecture. You have the same, so you cannot have different in different regions or different countries or different business units. Coming back then to acquisitions, if you're acquiring quite a lot of companies with different structures, that drives quite a lot of work to make that one. I'm not an expert in job leveling, and so maybe it's better to get somebody else's advice on the aspect. So I guess I pass.
Yeah, so we'll have to ask. We'll have to ask Philip. He's the head of Gradar. I mean, he might be a little biased on this, of course,
right?
But the thing, what I see is that if Europe is requiring this more rigorous job evaluation methodology to remove bias, to be able to have clean reporting in the future, and multinational companies that are doing business in Europe or acquisitions out of Europe, or they're acquiring companies with this methodology, and multinationals having to be compliant with regulation, that we may see a greater emergence in the point factor job evaluation methodology in the future. So I'm thinking that might be in the way. That's one of the main reasons why I've been working with Gradar so heavily over the past several years, is that the anticipation that this is where things might lead up overall on a global basis.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in terms of removing bias and subjectivity, and even the subjectivity in people answering a standard format. So if someone puts in that it requires a university degree, you need to really look at it and say, is that true? Is it really required? So it's even, you know, when you go to something that you think is objective, you still need to, you know, actually dig into it and look at it and say, well, are these requirements really needed? And, you know, are these job duties that you listed really part of this position? It's a challenging task.
Yeah, and also, I mean, is it fair as well? I mean,
Right.
you just brought up a good one there, Howard, as far as the, you know, university education. So in a lot of places around the globe, university education is quite a privilege, right?
Mm.
They have people that are more that get their experience through on-the-job learning in different aspects. I mean, they can be just as skilled and through, but they just don't go through those traditional aspects. And so we need to ensure that our job evaluation methodology considers this and it is fair on a global basis for sure. But a lot of great things coming up. And so when you're thinking about, so Timmy, you're talking about the complexities of the timeline. You know that you know, a lot of companies out there, multinationals, may not even be aware of some of the regulation, and some of the companies globally and in the European Union or so forth are now only have 2 years left to comply. And so, what are the best ways that companies can move the needle forward on this initiative so that they can meet regulations on the timeline that's proposed?
That's a good, great question. So coming back to the timeline, so the directive was voted through last year, and so all the countries have 3 years to say, okay, how was France, Germany, Italy do, you know, implement the directive? So it's 2 years left. So and some people that's very educated on the directive will say, hey Tim, it's actually 4 years in total, because the thing is, it's 3 years until each country will have to have something in place. But from the reporting perspective, you're supposed to report 2027. So actually, then it's still 3 years left. But the data you're supposed to report is on 2026. So come back to, it's still 2 years to understand what's the data look like. Do we pay people fairly? What business units, what countries, where's the challenges? And you have 2 years to improve your data or fix your pay gap. Because 2026, that's the data you will report 2027. So a lot of numbers here. If I had to bring it back for you to make clear as possible, I would say a good thing to get started with is to understand your pay gap. And I like the visualization of, you know, the tip of the iceberg, you know, Titanic, to understand what's on top. And I think most companies know sort of, or they know, okay, this is the average earnings of women, and this is from the men. However, most companies, I think, don't know when they're looking to under, you know, the iceberg in terms of if you're looking, for example, for pay versus performance. Most companies say we want to pay based on performance. That's a good thing. High performers should be high earners. But when we do the analytics of that data, quite often it shows actually you do not pay people based on performance. Performance is not a drive in your compensation. So you have a lot of high performers that are low earners and a lot of low performers that are high earners. So your pay philosophy is saying we want to pay people based on performance. It's not true. And that's underneath the iceberg. And those things will come up. So coming back to your question, Sam, it's a good question. I think it's a good thing to understand what's the iceberg. What I'm looking at. If you're the CEO, CFO, the HR director, or, you know, similar, how big is the iceberg? And in terms of what would it cost to improve the data or fix the problems or the challenges? And you have 2 years to do that. So a good thing is to understand your data, start improving it, and then from like 2026 and forward, you're supposed to report on it, you know, communicate to your managers, but get going with understanding your data. To understand the challenges, the risks, the opportunities. Maybe your data is great, fantastic. Use that as leverage in terms of employer branding, marketing. There's a lot of certifications going on. I don't know if that's a big thing in the States, but that's coming quite big in Europe. Be certified that you're an employer. And so if your data is good, that's great. I think you can leverage quite a lot of that doing those certifications as well.
So when we talk about the pay gap here, I'm going to go on and assume that we're referring to primarily an adjusted pay gap analysis rather than unadjusted pay gap. So for our listeners who may not know about the difference between unadjusted and adjusted, could you speak to a little bit about the qualifications that allow you to really dig down into that pay gap between men and women?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So I would say, so there's two different pay gaps. One we call the unadjusted pay gap. And that's very simple to calculate. That's all, the average earnings from the women versus the male. So in Europe, I think it's the commission in Europe that presents the data, or like Eurostat, they said, okay, the pay gap is Europe is 13%. That's true, but it's still not a big picture, because 13% in pay gaps only male earnings versus female earnings. What's interesting is to look at the adjusted pay gap. And there's a big difference, because the adjusted pay gap, you take into account like your grade, your tenure, age, performance, data like that. And you take into that account into your data model, how you calculate your pay gap. So for most companies, maybe you have a 10% pay gap. That's the unadjusted pay gap. But then when you take into account different factors like performance, your grade, tenure, similar, maybe your pay gap is 5%, which means actually you can explain 5% by saying male in all the men in this organization actually are older, have more experience, have a higher grade, have a high performance or whatever. Still, though, we have a 5% pay gap. That's the one we want to address. So sometimes those conversations become quite political. So always when you look at the pay gaps, you have to say, okay, what is it we're looking at? Is it the unadjusted or adjusted? Because actually it's the adjusted that is of most interest. Even though the unadjusted can say something, maybe you have a glass ceiling, so it's difficult to female employees to reach the high earning positions. That's another thing to look into. But yeah, I can go on long on this route, but that's a short explanation on the unadjusted adjusted.
Go ahead, Jackson.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the only reason I bring this up is because some organizations may look at their pay gap, just do a simple calculation and be like, oh my gosh, we have a 17% or 10% pay gap. However, the reason we use the adjusted pay gap is because those are considered justifiable reasons for differentiating pay. If you were to try to adjust based on the unadjusted pay gap, you would really be building in more inequity than you would be solving.
Yes.
How do you solve for things like tenure when women may leave the job force for some years if they're raising a family and they don't and they don't need support, and same thing I guess with performance ratings, how there's not bias in that as well.
Yeah, that's also a good question. So I think it's difficult to create those calculations by yourself, because you will most likely, if you're doing an Excel or similar, it's easy to make some errors. So we partnering with the firm in Germany, in Berlin, called Fair Pay Innovation Lab. And I think they are the largest research center in the world, or in Europe at least, doing science on how do you do the math models, how do we calculate this. So it's actually the truth, because with statistics and politics, so you can take one data or like the same data presented different ways, good story. But the reason why we do this is to answer the question, do we pay people fairly? And we want the data and everything, the math knowledge to be correct. So we spend quite a lot of time investing to this, how to calculate correctly, also taking support from Fair Pay Innovation Lab. Because it's easy, I think. We had one company that came to us and said, can you look into our data model? Because we think it's not true. It's not, we think we might have the wrong calculations. So we took that client's data, run it through a platform, and we got completely different data. So we did the same exercise, but we got this different results because their way of doing the adjusted pay gap had some errors. And those are difficult to spot, especially if you have a lot of population, complex Excel diagrams. Yeah.
It's definitely good to have a uniform methodology on how to accomplish this that's been tested. And so doing it on a worksheet can generate some, as Howard knows, Howard's a great proponent of using systems. You need to first have a system that's going to fairly evaluate jobs, such as the GRADAR system. That's better than just classification methodology. Then you have to have, if you're a pay for performance organization, you have to have a good trust in your performance management philosophy, right?
Mm.
And then of course, when you're doing your pay fairness studies, you need to have a system like Sysarb that's going to look at this in a very consistent in a global way, not just US centric, but
Mm.
also in all those areas across the globe that have differing regulations and so forth. I think that is critical.
Mm.
One other thing that I wanted to bring up is before it gets away from us is that Jackson brought up a good point about the difference between the adjusted and unadjusted pay gap analysis. Now, I would argue that we may think that the unadjusted analysis is somewhat inferior because it only looks at the simple calculation of male pay versus female pay. And a lot of that was put in place because it's simply easier for companies to get on the bandwagon and to start seeing the difference and having something that's easy to lift. And the unadjusted or the adjusted pay gap analysis is really where we see jobs of comparable worth coming together, jobs of similar experience and knowledge and skills that are comparable. And that gives us the real indicator. But I would also argue that it may be true that we want to move towards having the adjusted pay gap analysis now so we know what comparable worth is, but we shouldn't forget the unadjusted pay gap analysis of simply looking at male versus female pay, because that is an analysis that shows us a gap in opportunity, right? I mean, you were just talking to us earlier, Timmy, and saying that there's certain jobs that are female dominated and there's certain jobs that are male dominated in society. And this could exist. This may be the reality for the next 100 years, in different locations around the globe because of social norms and so forth. The important thing that we need to understand is that some of these jobs that are worth far more than they are now. And the only thing that's been keeping their pay down is bias, gender bias. I mean, why are teachers paid, low in some areas compared to others where it's paid higher? Some of that is explained by supply and demand, and then some of it is not explained by that. Some of it is explained by the bias aspect. The value of that job is simply not considered. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to consider as practitioners and future research going forward. So it's exciting times, as you said, Timmy.
Yeah, totally.
So go ahead, Tim.
No, go on. We have time for one more question. Go ahead, Jackson.
Well, yeah, I was really just going to say, as we're starting to come towards the end of our meeting, some of our listeners or just people listening back on this might feel the weight of pay transparency coming, on the horizon. And the best way to, address that is to kind of have a plan in place. So from your expertise, what do you think would be the best first steps to start to dig into this and prepare yourself for, even if you're not in Europe, the coming pay transparency laws in future years?
I think a good step for any company, no matter where you're based and no matter of your size, is to do what we call like a pay transparency audit. So we do like a workshop with our consultants the client can do this by themselves, but basically do a pay transparency audit. It's like a workshop where you're looking to, okay, do we have a pay philosophy in place? How do we want to pay people? Maybe you say maybe the CEO says, we want to pay the people based on performance. Great. Do we have that data? Usually the answer is no, we do not. At least not for all the business units or for everybody. Well, that's a good thing to put in place. Do we have like clear career paths? Do we have like a harmonized job title structure? Or is the title just all over the place? What's our acquisition strategy? How will that affect us in the future when it comes to pay transparency? So I think if you sit down with HR, like a CFO, the CEO, or like the leadership team, put down some of those questions, and they can reach out to me or to you, get some support. It's good questions to answer, because I think most companies or most leadership team have never sit down and look into those questions. And since pay or like a compensation is for most companies the biggest investment, I'm surprised. I've been in this industry for 5 years. I'm surprised how many companies only do an Excel analytics and quite few analytics, since 70% of your investment or something is in your people, your compensation. So you should be on top of that game. So I
Yeah,
think that's
certainly.
a step to just looking through those kind of questions as you okay, where are we at? Some, you know, health, no, diagnose yourself.
Yeah, without a doubt. And as you mentioned, so many organizations say that they're a pay for performance organization, but without a strong defensible performance review process, you really can't justify that when you get to the pay transparency side of things. So if you don't have that in place now, implementing any sort of performance review process is going to be a great step in the right direction.
And one more thing that could be good to have in mind is what kind of industry are you operating within? And so, for example, are you a male-dominated company or industry, maybe on like oil and gas or manufacturing, tech? By looking to like the public reports in Ireland, UK, and Australia, those are the industries that have the biggest challenges. And if you are within like healthcare, that's most commonly like a female-dominated industry, most likely your data is better. So what's your industry? What's the population in terms of gender distribution? That will give you a snapshot also of your most likely challenges when you look into the iceberg, so to say. So that can also be a good thing to have in mind. Yes.
Great. Well, thanks, Timmy. So I know that we're coming towards the top of our hour here. So if you're a listener out there and you're saying, well, geez, this is something that we need to do, go ahead to go to CompTeam in .NET and set up a 15-minute meeting, and we'll walk you through the process and make sure that you're ready for a solution like Sysarb, and making sure that your job evaluation is solid, and you're ready to go forward with that. Because I know that Timmy, you have a robust system that is part of your organization, and you're driving some great value to some well-known international companies right now that are using your service. So what would you like to, some of the last few things you'd like to have our listeners know about Sysarb?
Okay, so the short pitch. I mean, I'm the chief sales officer, so my short pitch. I mean, we've been doing this for 20 years. So it's a robust system. You will love it. It's very user-friendly. And we work with some of the biggest brands in the world, like Spotify, Carlsberg, Volvo, Disney, Pfizer, big ones. Some of them are working in, on the one market, some like globally. But it's fantastic software, 600 clients, 10,000 users. The average rating is like 4.9 or something out of 5. So yeah, it's a good software. And I think if you're a big company, maybe if you're less than 100, you could do Excel. But if you're a bigger one, you will most likely need software in the future. So it could be a good thing to look into this and be excited about analyzing your compensation structures.
Right. The bottom line is fairness and equality for all, making sure that we're doing the best as leaders and fiduciaries of your organizations to ensure that we're treating people right and fair. So thanks, Timmy, for taking us through this journey today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Timmy. It's really great.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning into this month's Reward Mastermind.